everyone, welcome back to the Book and Life podcast. Today we're going to have a brand new book guest on. Whether they're an author, an editor, a producer, you'll never quite know, so you're in for one hell of a ride. But today I just have to do the adverts and then I'll get us straight into that most important conversation. And as we do every week, I'm going to read The Shadow, which is part of the Time Guardian series, and this is book 4 from Marianne Curley. The battle is over, the war is won. The prophecy complete, but life can't just pick up where it left off for Ethan, struggling to cope with tragic loss. At odds with friends in the guard, he finds himself adrift, jumping in shadows and sensing someone who can't possibly be there. Blaming herself for the goddess Athena's death, Giselle swears revenge to vilify the immortals' plan for world domination. But Giselle hadn't planned on love, and that leaves her with an unbearable choice. Should she follow her heart or the strings of a goddess short on praise but high on expectation, who continues to pull her from the grave? As the guard and the order battle through the past and into an impossible future, darkness lurks round every corner. The fight for the world's survival rests with just one. Is it friend or foe who stands in the shadow? And just a reminder that The Price of Freedom by Rosemary Rowan, is being donated to the Ukraine refugee crisis. And here's the blurb for her book. It's one of her Roman British crime series, which was written under her maiden name. All editions can be found online where all books are sold, even her agents donating her commission. Sorry, I don't have the blurb for that, but that's what she's doing. And now, without further ado, let's get you to the guests.
Welcome back to the Book and Life podcast, guys. I have an incredible female author on with us today. I've been super excited about her coming on ever since her publicist sent me the info on her book. I am so excited to get my hands on an arc of this book. I am genuinely beyond excited. It is in the mail. It is on its way to me. I cannot wait to get reading it, and you guys will all have to listen out for the review podcast that will be coming up later on this year. But without further ado, let's invite Renee Carlino onto the show. How are you?
Good. Hello. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about the book. I've been talking about it a lot the last couple of weeks, so my voice is a little hoarse, but yeah, I'm excited to talk about it and to keep sharing it this way. So thank you for having me.
Of course, I mean that's just the great thing about the Book and Life podcast is we are all readers and we're all writers, most of us anyway. And I think everybody starts off as a reader and then we become writers because we're all got these stories that of our own lives that we want to share. And I think that's incredible. So how did you get inspired to write the story? Did you have an aha moment or was it just something that kind of just flew?
Well, this used to be us. It used to be called The Apartment, and it started out because a friend of mine was getting a divorce, and she we were having lunch one day and she said, we're getting a nesting apartment. They were still living together, but they were going through the beginning stages of a divorce, and I had no idea what that was. And I said, what's that? That sounds like a good thing. And it is, I think. It's basically where the children stay in the family home that they grew up in. These are two young teenagers. They stay in the family home, and then Danielle and Alex, the two main characters who are getting a divorce, they share an apartment. So they swap times at the family home. So they're never at either place together at the same time, but it was sort of a way for them to not have to have three separate places or to shuffle the kids back and forth between their own two places. So it was sort of a sacrifice that they made for the sake of their kids to be able to not have their whole world kind of turned upside down. So once I heard about that,
Yeah.
I started thinking about how interesting it would be to be in a space um, with your ex, even though they're not there at the same time, but to see what they, you know, just evidence of their existence in that space.
Yeah.
And then it went from there, and I started to develop the idea of them having this record collection that they write memories down on the sleeves, on the album sleeves, and that when they're there alone and they start feeling, you know, lonely, and they're it's, you know, the deafening silence of not having your kids running around what they're used to all the time. So they each kind of play the records and read the memories and revisit their past and why they fell in love and why things fall apart.
Yeah, that's such an amazing story. And the thing nowadays is you're hearing far more of these ideas on, well, how do we make a split better for the children? Like, and I think that's such a good way of thinking about it because once you commit to having a child, that child has to come first for everything. And I think it's nice to see it more being mainstream on like, well, how could we kind of go through a romance or go through this, incredibly tragic thing, but keeping the children in the center focus of that. And I think that's such an empowering and powerful story too. And I love the idea of it being sort of the old vinyl records that they're writing on too, because that's like it's becoming a trend again. Like vinyl records are becoming a thing again. So,
I think
it's
so.
interesting.
Sort of needed a device, and I've always thought of music. You know, music and smells are the things that sort of evoke memories the most. And just
Yeah.
thinking back to growing up and the songs that I remember my parents playing in the car, and where that would take me to in my own memory, and when my relationship started, things like that. So yeah, I knew that if the audience reading the book could sort of tap into that idea of playing a song, and then transporting that character back to that moment, then these two people who are pretty bitter and pretty resentful toward each other are getting a chance to relive the positive moments in their marriage. So
Yeah. And it's a good way of like taking away a lot of that spite because they're remembering it wasn't all bad. We didn't always do bad stuff to each other. We didn't always hurt each other. We didn't, do you know what I mean? I think that's really clever. And you don't see enough of that, I think, in contemporary romances, that a lot of relationship breakdowns are both people changing and moving in different directions. It's not necessarily that they fell out of love. It's the fact that things, they've drifted apart and they're on different paths and they're going in a different direction. And I think that's kind of really, I think the older we get, the more we kind of understand that. But when we're younger, we're very much like you're either in love or you're not. It's a very black and white world. And I think it's great to see more books that are showing kind of a wider range of experiences so that it's not just that, you've got to be in love, you've got to commit, you can't ever go through a stage where it's just not working. And I think that's a positive step forward for the industry for sure.
definitely.
So tell me, like, how did you get into romance writing? What drew you to writing this style?
Well, I think especially This Used to Be Us is definitely more women's fiction than romance. Even though
Yeah,
it has that contemporary feel. But I have to be honest, when I started writing my first book, I didn't really know what it was going to be. I didn't intend to write a romance novel. I just wanted to write a love story, and a love story is a romance novel. But there's just
yeah,
always such a sort of this misnomer for people who have never read romance. You know, there's this
yeah,
idea that it's a certain type of book, or that it's all about the sex or whatever it is. But
yep,
it's really, there's really so much romance out there that's sort of marketed and sold as romance, because the people who do read romance read a lot of books. But it's like a love story. I mean, and if
yeah,
we look back and we think about books like The Bridges of Madison County, like I don't think anyone would have called that a contemporary romance. But if I wrote that book
no,
now, it would be called a contemporary romance, or women's fiction.
yeah,
So yeah, it's sort of the way that things are marketed. But I didn't intend. I wanted to write a story about a girl who was like, that age, after college, or and before you've decided who you want to be with or what you want to do, or if you know what career you're going to have, and just a girl kind of finding herself and finding herself through. And in that book, Sweet Thing, there's also a lot of music, and there's also a lot of reflecting on her childhood and growing up and taking over her father's business in New York. And um, it was always a story about a girl and her experiences. It was super fun to write about the attractive guy in the story too,
Yeah.
but I didn't know for sure that it was. I didn't know that it was going to be a romance until I was done writing it, and I sent it to someone, and she said, "Oh, this is such a good romance novel." And I thought to myself, "Well, I guess it's romance." I was always
Yeah, it's amazing how marketing changes like everything we do. Like I had the same idea as you. I wrote this story about twin sisters who turned on each other and who were stuck in these two love triangles, and they were so polar worlds apart, and like how do you bring them back together? And to me, I didn't see the romance in it. I saw this story about twin sisters who were obnoxious to each other and had a really dysfunctional family. And I took it to a publisher, and it was one of my big national releases, and I was sitting there and I was like, what do you mean this is romance? Like just because I'd written other romance novels, they just automatically were like, oh, you're a romance writer, so it has to be romance. And I'm like, no, this is literacy, this is fiction. This is fiction, general fiction. It's not focused on romance.
right.
And no matter how much I argued with it, marketing pushed me in that direction. And I think that I don't know, but I think now as writers we're all starting to kind of think, well, how does a marketing team look at this? Or how would an editor class this book? Like I think that's starting to become something that we're all thinking about, and we're all aware of because we're kind of scared to cross those lines of just writing the story we want to write?
Yes, and there's definitely an element for me, being able to. I almost wanted to put a warning at the beginning of the book that it wasn't. Don't expect a romance novel, even though I had written so many, because you're sort of guaranteeing that emotionally satisfying ending in a romance novel.
Yeah,
And I mean, for me, I felt like in this book, and I don't want to give away the ending of the book, but I felt like it was complete, and there what I the characters had arcs, like, and there was theme in
yeah,
it. Things were brought together at the end, and I felt like it was emotionally satisfying, even though it may not go the way that a very avid romance reader would expect. So I think that's the only one kind of
yeah.
negative feedback that I got, but I wouldn't change anything about it. I was starting
No,
to
I
feel.
wouldn't because yeah. I mean, from what I've seen and what I've read and the research I've done, I think you've got very strong arcs just from like the synopsis and the blurbs and how you've laid it out and how you've presented it. And that's the key. Like, this is something I think I've covered in a previous podcast, but storytelling it's an art form in which you're telling arcs about maybe multiple characters or one character, and you're taking them on a journey of self-discovery and self-improvement. And whatever happens along the way to them is just stepping stones for them to get to the end of their journey, to becoming either happy or finding their love or finding themselves. It's not, I don't think there should be a pre-planned destination on every story. It should be about the arc, it should be about the transformation, it should be about the experiences of the character and the story that they tell, and not about it has to be happily ever after or it has to be happy for now. I think that's something that I find frustrating as an author is to know, okay, I have to fit a certain destination in at the end. I think, and I don't know if you agree, but I find that a very frustrating element that I have to deal with nowadays. Do you ever feel that way too?
Yeah, definitely. I think there is when you read, and I try not to read too many reviews, but just getting feedback
Yeah,
from my readers about what their expectation is for something. And so many times I'll read a review that says this isn't my favorite trope, but and constantly talking about tropes and constantly talking about the type of
Yep.
the romance it is or new adult. I was really pigeonholed in that for a long time because that's what I started writing. But I was
Yep.
getting older and I was just not connecting with characters that were in their 20s anymore. So I wanted my readers to be able to grow with me and with characters. And yeah, there were times where you feel limited. And I remember writing synopses really early on that all kind of had the same, sort of formula for
Outline, yeah.
for sure.
Y- Yeah, and I think as I think the industry almost has to understand is like I started writing when I was sort of 19, and I look back and I'm like, I'm not who I was at 19. I should be allowed to like mature into other genres. Like, please stop making me stay in one genre. I want to grow as a person. I want to stretch my wings. I want to experience different storytelling skills and abilities. And I think um, in the mind of a lot of the publishers, and I say this with pure love for them because their jobs are not easy, but I think they get so used to saying, okay, they've got an audience set in this genre. We have to keep them in this genre because it makes our jobs easier and it means that it's easier for us to sell the books.
Right.
But what they forget is that not only are we growing as people, but the readers that we've sort of picked up along the way, they're also growing and maturing with us. And they're not going to always want to read what we were writing at the beginning of our careers. They're going to want to see us do different genres or different types of stories because they're experiencing different things in their lives too. And I think as almost as writers, we kind of have to remind the editors ourselves, like, hey, we're maturing and we're having our own different experiences, and this is the stuff that's inspiring us, and this is the stuff that's making us passionate. So let us explore this. If it's something you can work with, great. If it's not, then I can go and find somebody else that might want to work with it or might be interested in it. And that way, I'm not letting my readers down. The ones that have stuck with me from day one, I'm allowing them to experience other things and to go and learn a little bit more about where I'm maturing to see if it's fits in with their reading habits and what they want to do.
Right. I agree.
And I think it's great because on this show, like I'm hearing from other writers that we're all starting to kind of speak up a little bit more as well. And I'm just hoping that it has the positive impact that we're all hoping for. And the agents don't just see us as, oh, nightmare client who wants to mature and change like direction, which means they have to then change what they're researching for us. Hopefully they can just like move with us and it's not so constricting. But um, I think when you find a place that's understanding of that, hang on to them is kind of always been my message and my kind of cue to writers as they're going on their journey. So what are you reading right now that's kind of getting you excited? Is there any books out right now that you're particularly enjoying?
Um, I mean, I read a lot, but uh, I haven't read anything that's super current lately. I read Normal
It's
People.
just anything that gets you excited because like that's what we like as writers we tend to get inspired when we're reading stuff that we find exciting or we find passionate, and it's always good for like listeners to hear new sort of books that maybe they haven't heard of before. um you never know, maybe what you're reading now might resonate with one of our listeners.
You know, I mean, speaking to sort of what inspired when I was meant to write This Used to Be Us, also, I think that would be even more, that would make even more sense to talk about. I read Fates and Furies, which is a story about a couple, and it is sort of two
Yeah.
sides to every story. I was also reading a lot of nonfiction about marriage, about relationships,
Yeah.
and Esther Perel, and I was looking at a lot of articles about that. So that's kind of what I was reading. When someone told me about the Sally Rooney about Normal People, I'm really attracted to and like the idea of following characters over a longer period of time. even though in this used
Yeah.
to be us, it's only a few years, but in some of my other books, it's 15 years, or but I think people, if they're listening and they're aspiring writers or they're just starting out writing, I always say write what you like to read, and
Yeah.
write what you want to read, and also because I think in the beginning of a writer's career, or if they've always aspired to be a writer, they are kind of have this idea of like the next great American literary novel or something in their minds. But
Yep.
then the truth is, how many of those do you read a year versus articles, or a little bit, guilty pleasures, romance novels, thrillers, whatever it is. So
Yeah.
I remember for so long, genre fiction had such a bad rap. And people would just put it in this one category, and it was almost like you weren't an intelligent person unless you were reading really cerebral literary fiction or something like that.
Yep.
And that's just
Or you
that.
were reading classics. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
or the classics, yeah. And I always I didn't love that, because I thought that it really can be discouraging to a writer. So like in the beginning, the first book you write doesn't have to get published. It likely won't, and it's very hard to get a book published. So write what you want to read, and it'll come out that much
Yeah, it
easier.
is.
Yeah, and I think writing also, write what you know. And I know that people who write like science fiction, they have all these elements of world building, and that's really wonderful. But if you're just starting out and you don't have the mind of, um, you know to write, Game of Thrones or Harry Potter or whatever, if you don't have that sort of imagination, then write what you do know. I don't go there. I don't fantasize or think about worlds that don't exist. I love science fiction. I love reading it. I totally enjoy it. But when I'm sitting around thinking about stories, and I'm always thinking about contemporary relationships, family relationships, and
Yeah.
dynamics, and the nuances in marriage and things like that. So that's always my advice when people ask me about, well, how do you? I always want to write a book, and like, how do you do? I'm like, write exactly what you want to read, and don't be embarrassed of it. No one
Yep.
has read it yet. You can write it, and then
Yep.
you trash it, or if you think it's strong, then pursue it. But instead of trying to
And
go in,
don't feel like you have to write what's in the market as well. That's something
right,
else I say to people a lot because when I first started out, like I was just writing the most generic romance novel, like ideas that I had, and then one day I was sitting with a group of friends who just happened to be professional wrestlers, and they're like, "You grew up in wrestling. Why don't you write a story in wrestling?" And the next thing I knew, I did, and I had this small little publisher in America who were like, "Wrestling romance? That's never been done before." And the next thing I knew, my first book was out, and I'm like, "Huh, okay."
yeah,
You know, and then it was a case of, sometimes what you think would be the most ludicrous idea of all actually ends up being the thing that gets your foot in the door and gets you published. And I know that it helped a lot of wrestlers who were out on the road because, they were like, yeah, we would have women that had never watched wrestling before. They happened across your book, they read your book, and the next thing we knew, we had a diehard fan
yeah,
tuning in every week. And that's still crazy to me this day. Like I still hear that story. Like, hey, I read your movies world, and the next thing I knew, I was watching WWE every week. is that's just mind blowing. But it doesn't always have to fit the market. You don't have to be like studying the market going, oh my gosh, this market's really hot right now. Because I'm guaranteeing you, by the time you finish writing your book and you finish editing your book and you find a publisher that's want to publish it, the market will have moved on by then.
right.
The
It will.
market changes every friggin' week.
I've
So
said that many
don't
times too.
don't be
Don't
studying it and prioritizing it.
True, true.
Yeah.
Yeah, never write to the market, because it will change by the time you get it out. And even though publishers, when you're pitching a book, whether you have a finished manuscript or you're just pitching on a synopsis and 3 chapters, they're always going to want comps. So you do have to kind of like find those things, and even if
Yeah.
it morphs into something else, I can't tell you how many. I wrote a lot of books on a synopsis in 3 chapters. Most of the books, except for This Used to Be Us and my first book, which I had written full manuscripts before I sold it. All of the other ones, the the story changed so much from the synopsis. It no longer
Yeah.
even so that's like it's important to think about that. And yeah, it takes a long time, a lot longer than people think, to really have a strong, chance in the publishing world. It takes a long time to get through editorial and everything else, and you rewrite so much. And
And also yeah, and also when you're doing, I think a lot of your writing, and I only learned this because I went to university last year and I studied advanced creative writing. Um, you have to understand that there is companies out there that's going to want a specific template to every book because they've built hundreds of years of tradition on it. I know that is the case for Mills and Boon, for example. So sometimes you have to be aware of like, okay, it's really awesome to be presenting this book to a publisher, but you have to understand it has to, some of them it has to fit a certain template. It's not that your story's bad and that's why you're getting rejected. It's because there's also, they all have templates, some of them that they have to stick to. And if you're not ticking certain boxes, they can't put it out because that's not what their base is looking for. And they can't take that risk that their fan base is going to get turned off by getting a book that doesn't tick the boxes that they're used to.
right, makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, I it took me a long time to figure that out, and I've actually learned how to write within a template now, because I was very much I grew up in the very way of just writing whatever came naturally to me or wherever the story went and just saying, oh, sod it, we'll see where it goes. And then I realized, sort of like kind of a couple of years ago, wait, I actually need to understand that if I'm writing for a certain group, I need to know what their templates are so that they're not going to just throw me in the bin because I don't tick, you know, X, Y, and Z. And if you're going for particular publishing companies that need boxes ticked, then you need to be aware of that. So sometimes do a little research on the people that you are talking to before you submit, because that just saves you guys time and it saves them time. And it shows them that you're committed to what they're putting out and you understand what they're trying to do as well. And like that scores you brownie points anywhere in the industry.
Yes, makes sense.
Yeah. So where do you see your next project going? Where's your kind of plan for moving on after this one?
Well, I am writing another book now. Um, I I don't think I would describe it. I think it falls, and it's in the same vein as This Used to Be Us. It's about the challenges of being
Yeah,
married, but also facing some tragedy, and how we deal with tragedy and trauma, like within our relationships, and how our relationships
yeah.
are characters. And that's why I like writing dual points of view. I like writing from both, both, both in the relationship. I like.
Characters' points of view. Yeah, yeah,
Mhm. So that's what I'm working on right now. I'm not sure where it will land. I have since my first 6, 7, 8, 9 books. I have taken a lot more time to write a book and
yeah.
not put myself on any kind of deadline. Like I said, I wrote the whole manuscript for This Used to Be Us before we sold it. So I had
Hmm.
no deadlines, and it was really freeing, and just came out organically, and I wrote when I wanted to. And though in many ways it's a discipline that people probably have this very romantic idea of writers, writing into the wee
Yep,
hours of the night with, a glass, like a cup of whiskey or something. And that's just never
yep.
been my experience. I wake up at
No,
really early in the morning and I write for as long as I can go without getting redundant or tired. So it's usually 3 or 4 hours. And I used to give myself a number of words that I used to give myself like a word number goal for every
yeah.
day. I kind of don't do that anymore. I just let it come out organically. So,
And that's the thing. Like every writer is different. I mean, I have to have very tight structure and very tight routines. So for me, like I get up in the morning, I check my messages, I check my emails. before I even get the coffee going. And then once I've got the coffee going, I can say, okay, what needs answering now and what can I put off till I finish writing? And that's kind of how I set my day up. And being the fact that I've been in the industry since 2008, I've learned all the stuff not to do to burn yourself out. So I was one of those writers that had like the gigantic gallon cup of coffee and would just write till I had the word count down for the day. And it's so stressful, it does burn you out, and I feel like that then gets transitioned into your work. So one thing that I learned was, okay, it's all right if I have a day where I maybe write 2 hours. It's okay if I have a day where I can't write a single thing. I just need to not push it. I need to not try and drive something out of myself that just isn't there. And by doing that, I feel like my writing has definitely improved. Yes, it takes me longer to put stuff out, but it's also allowed me to try other things and other art forms that has almost made it freeing for my mind because I've been able to go and try screenwriting. I've been able to try and write um, podcast scripts, things like that. And that's almost been a good reset for me because it's been like a palate cleanser. So I get a little bit of a break between books and I can go, oh, okay, I can step away for a little bit and I can clear my mind and not be caught up in my characters because I write long term story series. So sometimes I'll be stuck in a series for a while and I need to cleanse the palate before I can go on and write something else. Um, and that seems to be my best advice is sometimes find a hobby outside of writing so that when you're having days where you're super frustrated and you cannot get it, or you're just not getting the words that you want, or you don't feel like it's working, step away and do something else. Take
Right.
a break. It's okay to take your time. It's the ones that say, yeah, I can do a novel in 4 weeks. I bet you my life they stress the every day for 4 weeks, and
Yeah.
it is brutal. I've done it. I know that for a fact because I was one of those younger ones that was like, oh, I could do a book in 4 weeks. I'll show you. And I went and I did it in 4 weeks, and I think I literally slept 3 days afterwards, like almost straight because
Yeah.
it's so stressful and it's not the way you want to do this because you'll just burn out so quickly.
Yeah,
So
and
quickly.
quality is usually, and that's why I cut myself off when I feel myself getting tired or redundant. Like I said, because
Yeah.
I noticed really early on that if I wrote 5,000 words in a day, which was a lot for me, I would, you always reread when you go back in to start again the next day, and I would reread it and notice that from the beginning of that 5,000 words to the end, it was the quality was different. By the time I got to
Yeah.
finally quitting, the last 3 or 4 pages were really terrible, and I ended up deleting them
Yeah.
anyway. So there's like almost no sense in doing that. Um, Taking
No.
your time is a lot, though it is a discipline. I do say that it's not going to happen magically. It takes a long time to write a book. It's very delayed gratification. You have to go in and like the process and know and have the knowledge that potentially you will never get published and potentially you will never make $1 and potentially no one will ever read it. I mean, because that's the plain truth of it. The publishing world is not a predictable type of business, and
No.
it's very volatile and
Not dependable either. No.
not dependable, and not a, I don't know a lot. I don't know very many authors who don't have another job or have
Yeah.
something else that
That's
they
true.
do to make money, because you could, I mean, unless you are really, are you, unless you're sitting on the New York Times bestseller list for 6 months, you're really not, because of how long it takes. Like from the time I sold this book until it was published, it was almost 2 years. So imagine, like,
Yeah.
that was 2 years of not making money from that book. But and yeah, so I think that
And
I
then those advances only last so long.
know, and sometimes the publishing, the payment schedules are really delayed, and so
Yeah.
I would say to people, you can't go in with the idea that someone is going to publish it and read it. You have to just really like going in there and writing, and
Yeah.
that's what I enjoy. I thought I would quit because I adapted 2 of my books into screenplays. I started in film, and so when I finished the book, The Last Post, I thought that would be the last novel that I wrote. I was really burnt out. And I adapted those two scripts. I started writing a TV pilot, and then I just found myself writing another book, and sort of realized that
Yeah.
even that I actually really love it, I just don't love the pressure of it. And so it's
Yeah.
once you kind of take that away, then it can be really enjoyable.
I mean that's also something that I realized because I wrote my first screenplay this well, I've written screenplays before, but this was the first one I had where a director was like, I want to make this. I had no clue about how many rewrites I was going to have to do or how many meetings I was going to have to sit through with them saying we don't like this bit and we don't like this bit and working with another writers who maybe didn't agree with the direction that I had set things up, and it was a very big learning experience for me, very eye-opening. Um, but I think it's allowed me to understand arcs a lot better as well, because with screenwriting, it's everything that the person sees. You're literally showing them, not telling them everything. And you've got to almost let them fill in a lot, like fill in stuff for themselves. And that's something that we do in novel writing. We just do it in a much bigger, grander scale. Um, and I'm glad I had that experience. I don't know if you felt like it gave you a little bit more insight into writing novels, but I felt like it gave me that experience and that knowledge I needed to be able to improve my novel writing and to understand how to give people what they were asking of me in such a way that it worked for both the story and for them.
Yeah, and I think that in the film industry, I think a lot of filmmakers, producers, directors are hesitant to let the novel writer adapt the story. But because I had
Yeah,
gone to film school and I wrote scripts before I wrote novels. I knew how to look at it from the outside in. The novel is the finished product, and the script
yeah,
is sort of like an outline. So novelists really want to put a whole bunch of details and they want to put a whole bunch of direction in it, and you really can't. A script is really
yeah.
dialogue, a
You
little
can't
bit of
know.
direction, and that's it. Because you have a production designer that's going to paint the walls, right?
Yep,
You have a director that's going to um, direct on inflection and tone, and you're not going to have to describe exactly the way someone's saying something. It's their
yep,
interpretation. You have you have a cinematographer who is showing, right? So the script itself
yeah.
really just it's really just sort of like a guide. But
It's a
that's
roadmap. Yeah,
it's a roadmap.
yeah,
The finished product is the film itself, and that's where all those other pieces come in. So writing novels, it's so much fun for me because I get to decide all those things: the way each character says
yeah.
something, the way something looks, everything, the way the style of clothes someone wears. So really different experience. But because I knew how to write a script, I knew that I remember one of like the early note when I first started writing the script for Before We Were Strangers. I remember I was working with a producer at the time, and he was like hesitant to let me write the script. He was like, don't, you don't need to put that much like detail in it." And I'm like, "No, I know what a script is. It's basically dialogue. I mean, a few little, you gotta set up where things are happening in time and space to
Yeah.
a degree, and a little bit of direction, and sometimes some sense of how someone's saying something. But ultimately, it's gonna change. It's gonna veer far from what you write in a novel. So yeah.
Envisioned. Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I found that because when we did Marie's World as a pilot, and they were like, I was a dancer. I'd done drama, I'd done stage, I'd done all this other stuff. And they're like, well, you know the dance industry, do the script. And I did the script. And they were like, no, no, we need you to break down the dance routines. And I'm like, wait, that's not what goes in the script though. And they're like, no, 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 but would you give us like the roadmap of what the dance sequences would look like? I that was when I found I preferred writing novels at that moment in time because I was like, in my head, she just does these lifts. I don't have to explain what they are. I don't have to I don't have to put that in. And but because the director had never worked with a street style called Apache, he had no clue how it would look or how it would feel, and he didn't know of any choreographers that could show him. So I almost had to kind of educate him on how Apache and how wrestling are so similar.
Oh, interesting.
Um, and that's the only time that I've ever had to put a lot of detail into a script. And that was simply just because they didn't know how the two styles would run parallel to each other.
Right.
But I felt like I learned a lot, and I always say to writers like don't just like keep a diary and don't just focus on novel writing. Try and experience as many different forms of writing as possible because you will pick up tools that will improve your novel writing by doing other things. And I think I was always so hesitant about going to university to learn to write, but now that I've done both the sort of creative writing and the advanced creative writing, I realize that there is actual benefits of going through it and actually doing the courses because you learn things you wouldn't think. You learn things about poetry, you learn things about life writing. Maybe you're even writing the wrong genre of books entirely. And by doing the course, then sometimes that's the only way you find these things out. Or by trying different things is the only way you find things out. Um, and you know, I think that's the best piece of advice that at the moment in this stage of my career that I could give people.
Yes, definitely. I agree. Yeah.
Well, you made it through the Book and Life podcast. And it's been an amazing time to have you on and to talk to you. And I, by the way, love the sound of your next book, and I really hope your publicist sends it to me so I can have it as part of a review for when it comes out, and definitely have you back to talk about it. So, thank you again so much for coming on. Guys, I want to remind you to be safe this week. For all of you guys that are in Texas, I am thinking about you guys, especially with you guys going through this awful hurricane thing. And for any of you else who's dealing with a tough time, know that we are here and we are talking books and we are being supportive of all of you just as much as you support all of us. So thank you again, and I will see you all again next week.